Good morning, fourth graders. Today we are on page 243 of your student journal. And even though we are still in our geometry section, we're moving on to something a little bit new. So we're on Unit 11, Lesson 4. Our goal today is, I will classify quadrilaterals by lines and angles, period. Okay, so classify just really means like kind of to group. That's what classify means. We're going to be grouping these quadrilaterals. Okay, we have a lot of new vocabulary today, and this is going to be crucial that you actually kind of almost memorize all this vocabulary over the next few days. So our first word is, what does congruent mean? Congruent means same size of equal measure. So we can put an equal side. Okay, then we have quadrilateral. A quadrilateral is a closed shape with 4 straight sides. So, and when we say straight, we mean something that's not curvy. So I'm going to show you an example of what would not be. So if I had 1, 2, 3, 4, that would not be, because this is a curved side. But if I had 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 3, 4, anything where the sides are straight, and then they also have to be closed. So if I had 1, 2, 3, 4, that would also not be a quadrilateral, because this is what they mean by has to be closed. Okay? Then we have this little square means a right angle. And then these little dashes show equal sides. So I'll explain those a little bit more. Okay, so there are 5 types of quadrilaterals that you're going to be responsible to be able to name and understand why they have the name they have. So our first one is called a trapezoid. Okay, a trapezoid can look very different. There's not a lot of rules about a trapezoid, but here's its rule. At least one pair of opposite sides are parallel. So if I look at the trapezoid, which sides are parallel in this one? The top and the bottom. Those 2 lines will never ever touch. And there's nothing really special about its angles. That's just the only rule a trapezoid has to have. Now it says it's at least one pair, because you'll see that other shapes could be called trapezoids and they have more than one pair. Okay, then we have a parallelogram. A parallelogram says both pairs of opposite sides are congruent. Okay, both sides of opposite sides are congruent. So the way that they showed this is these 2 little dashes and these 2 little dashes. That means that this and this are equal to each other. Those 2 little dashes and 2 little dashes, because they match, it's saying that those 2 sides are equal or congruent in size. And then there's 1 dash and 1 dash, so that says that this side and this side are congruent. So they give them the matching symbols. Okay, it also says that both pairs of opposite sides are parallel, which means this top line and this bottom line are parallel. Those will never ever touch. And then we also have, I'm looking for a better marker to show you. I'm going to have to use a different color than green. We also have this side is parallel to that side. So there's few things with the sides, and then for our angles it says opposite angles are equal. So if you look here, this looks like an acute angle, and this is also an acute, and they're the same. So they also try to show that with the 2 little lines there and 2 lines there. And then I have an obtuse and an obtuse that are equal. Okay, my next shape is called a rhombus. Sometimes my students used to call it they like to call it like a squish square. But a rhombus says all sides are congruent, so that's why they all have 1 dash. And then it also says both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. So this side is parallel to this side, and this side is parallel to this side. And then opposite angles are equal. So if you think about it, the rhombus is very similar to the parallelogram. It follows all the parallelogram rules. The only difference is this one has 4 equal sides and this has 2 pairs of equal or congruent sides. Okay, then we have our rectangle, which this is a shape you've been doing since kindergarten. Our rectangle says both pairs of opposite sides are congruent. So this 1 dash and this 1 dash means those 2 sides are congruent or equal. 2 dash and 2 dash means this side and this side are both equal or congruent. It also says both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. So this side is parallel to this side, and this side is parallel to that side. And then it says all 4 angles are right. Okay, and our square says all sides are congruent. So that's why they all have 1, 2, 3, those 4 little dashes. And then both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. So that's parallel and this, and then all 4 right angles. So really a square is the same rules as the rectangle. The only difference is this has 4 congruent sides and this has 2 pairs. Okay, so before we look at the steps, another thing that would really help you is to kind of understand this. They call it a hierarchy of quadrilaterals. It's just kind of the rules. So what I want you to understand about this is everything above it follows the same rules. So the rules get kind of stricter as you go down. So I'm going to zoom out so we can kind of look at this together, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So a quadrilateral has the least rules to follow. All you have to do is have 4 sides and be closed, and you get to be called a quadrilateral. A trapezoid follows the quadrilateral rules, but then it also has a new rule that says it has to have at least 1 pair of opposite sides. So this trapezoid also could be called a quadrilateral because it follows this rules and its own rules, okay? Now, a parallelogram, which is under the trapezoid, a parallelogram follows the trapezoid rules. Because to be a trapezoid, you have to have at least 1 pair of parallel sides. A parallelogram follows those rules, but it has more strict rules. It also has to have 2 pairs of parallel sides, not just 1. But this parallelogram could also be called a trapezoid. And if it could be called a trapezoid, it could also be called a quadrilateral, because a trapezoid could be called a quadrilateral. Okay, we're going to go to this one next. So then the parallelogram goes to rhombus. A rhombus follows the rules of a parallelogram. It has 2 pairs of opposite sides, but then it gets another rule on top of it and says has to have 4 equal sides. But this rhombus, because it followed this rules, and this rules, this rhombus could also be called a parallelogram, a trapezoid, and a quadrilateral. So a rhombus is its best name, but it follows the rules for those shapes. Okay, then the rhombus goes to a square. So a square follows the rules of a rhombus, which means 4 equal side lengths. A square follows the rules of a parallelogram with 2 pairs of opposite parallel sides. A square follows the rules of a trapezoid with at least 1 pair of parallel opposite sides, and a square follows the rules of a quadrilateral with 4 closed sides. So a square could also be called a rhombus, a parallelogram, a trapezoid, and a quadrilateral. Okay, now Going down here though, a parallelogram, we skipped this rectangle. Notice how the rectangle does not have an arrow coming from the rhombus. The rectangle follows the rules from the parallelogram, which means it has two pairs of opposite parallel sides. It follows the trapezoid rules, but not the quadrilateral. But it does not follow the rhombus rules. Rhombus means 4 equal sides, and this does not have one, or 4 congruent sides. So the rectangle cannot be called a rhombus. It can only be called what's above it. So the rectangle follows a parallelogram's rules, it follows a trapezoid's rules, and it follows a quadrilateral's rules, and obviously a rectangle's rules that it's a parallelogram, but it's a special one because it has 4 right angles. So that's how this hierarchy works, is everything above it going backwards with the arrows, it also could be called. Okay, so I'm going to get started, ladies and gentlemen, on my problem. And here is my first problem. It says, what quadrilateral is this? Explain your answer. Okay, so I'm going to look, first I'm going to kind of look for or determine, are there any congruent sides? Okay, so what do I see of congruent sides? This symbol tells me that all those sides are actually equal. That's what that tells me. That tells me that MF is equal to all the sides, to MR, we could say to equal to RS, and equal to FS. Pretty much it tells me that there's 4 congruent sides. I also see, when I look at it, that I see that MF is parallel to RS. MF and RS will never touch. I also see that MR is parallel to FS. Those are parallel, so it has two pairs of opposite parallel sides. What else do I see about the sides? I see that MR, this one, is perpendicular to RS because MR and RS create a right angle. And I see that MF is perpendicular to FS because MF and FS form right angles, and I can do that for all of them. So there's a lot of stuff I'm seeing there. Okay, I'm going to look at what I know about the angles, and I could use my Post-it note if I needed to. That is a right angle. That is a right angle. That is a right angle. So it has 4 right angles. Okay, so pretty much I have 4 congruent sides and 4 right angles. So what shape has 4 congruent sides and 4 right angles? That would be called a square. And that is my explanation, is a square is the only shape that has 4 congruent sides and 4 right angles. Okay, let's look at another one. All right. So, what shape is this? Explain why it is not a rectangle. Okay, so I'm first going to look for congruent sides. I see these little dashes, 1, 2, 3, and 2. Okay, so that does tell me that these, I think actually, ladies and gentlemen, they must have made an error here because those are not equal. That would be impossible. I'm pretty sure our book made a mistake because those obviously are not equal. This is shorter than this one. Sometimes our textbook tends to do that. I'm going to give that 4 lines and say those are not congruent. Okay, so I'm going to say no equal sides. It doesn't really help me much, but what else do I know about them? I can see that this line and this line are parallel. So I could say FS is parallel to WG. Those are definitely parallel. Okay. So I have one pair of parallel sides. I see that. What else do I see? Okay, let's look at some angles. I see two right angles, but I don't see opposite angles equal, because a lot of my rules were opposite angles equal, which means this to this. Okay, so really I'm not getting a lot of information. So it definitely does not follow the rules of a rectangle. And I know it's not a rectangle because a rectangle has to be a rectangle, you have to have, a rectangle has 4 right angles, and it has to be a parallelogram. And a parallelogram means 2 pairs of parallel sides, and it doesn't have that. And it also has 2 pairs of congruent sides. That is what you need to be a rectangle. You have to have 4 right angles, has to be a parallelogram, which means 2 pairs of parallel sides, and then you have to have 2 pairs of congruent sides. That's why this is not a rectangle. So I'm saying it's not a rectangle, but it is a trapezoid. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, let's look at some together. We're on page 245. And here is our first one. Okay, so what do we see here? Let's look at see if there's any congruent sides. So I see that AC is equal to BD. Those are congruent. They show us with our 2 dashes. I see AB is congruent to CD. Okay, so what does that tell us? We have 2 pairs of, sorry, that's sloppy, of congruent sides. What else do we see about our sides? I see that AC is parallel to BD. This and this will never touch. And then isn't AB also parallel to CD? This and this will never touch. So we have 2 pairs of parallel sides. What else do we see? Don't I also have angles? Isn't this angle look like it's the same as that? So angle C looks like it's equal or congruent to angle B. And doesn't angle D look the same as angle A? So angle A looks to be congruent to angle D. So we could say opposite angles are congruent. There's lots of information I'm seeing. So what shape fits all that information I'm seeing? What of my shapes fit it? And we want to give it its most specific shape, so I'm going to say its most specific shape is it's a parallelogram. And why? What does a parallelogram have to have? We could use this to help us. It has to have both pairs of opposite sides are congruent, both pairs of opposite sides are parallel, and opposite angles are equal. Did it follow all those rules? Yep. Opposite sides are congruent, opposite sides are parallel, and opposite angles are congruent. Okay, let's look at our last one. What shape is this? Explain why the shape below is not a rhombus. Okay, well, there's only 2 shapes that have 4 right angles. The only 2 shapes that have right angles are squares or rectangles. And this is not a square because it doesn't have 4 equal sides. So I know this has to be a rectangle. Why is this not a rhombus? What was the rule of a rhombus that it's missing? So it does not, we could say it is not a rhombus because what is it missing? And if you need to, you can always look back at that cheat sheet, but I know it's not a rhombus because it does not have 4 congruent sides. That's what a rhombus needs to have, 4 congruent sides. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, again, you're really going to be responsible to memorize those shapes and what makes those shapes them, what the rules that they follow. So today you have quite a few pages to, actually I apologize, you only have 1 page to try. All right, have a great day.